The first thing August Reeve noticed about Gallows Creek was that it had been named by someone with either a sense of humor or a sense of prophecy, and he could never quite decide which. He arrived on the Tuesday afternoon train from Cheyenne with 2 leather camera cases, a wooden tripod strapped across his back like a cross he hadn't asked to carry, and a commission from Harper's Weekly to produce 12 photographs of authentic frontier life for their November edition. He was 27 years old. He had been as far west as Pittsburgh once and considered it sufficient adventure. The town was smaller than the railroad pamphlet had suggested. 1 hotel that was actually a boarding house, 1 saloon, 1 jail, 1 church sitting on a limestone shelf at the top of the only hill in town, its bell tower empty of any bell, painted white in a way that suggested someone had intended it to be a landmark and succeeded only in making it look startled against the gray Wyoming sky. Mrs. Clara Fitch, who ran the boarding house, gave him a room with a window that faced the creek directly. 50 cents a night. Breakfast included if he was willing to eat before 6 in the morning. He looked out the window that first evening and thought the water seemed high for May, running fast and brown and with a particular urgency, like something that had somewhere important to be. "Does it flood much?" he asked her at dinner. She set down a bowl of something gray and substantial that may have been stew. "Every few years," she said, "when the snowmelt comes fast up in the bow legs. And this year?" She looked at the window. The creek was making a sound like someone talking in the next room, too low to make out the words, too persistent to ignore. "This year," she said, "I'd sleep with your boots on." He woke at 4 in the morning to a sound like the earth clearing its throat. He went to the window. The creek had crossed its banks in the night, a flat brown sheet of water spreading through the lower end of town with the calm, unstoppable patience of something that had been planning this for a long time and saw no reason to hurry now that it had finally arrived. The corrals near the livery were knee-deep. 3 horses stood in their pen looking personally offended. A rooster had taken refuge on a fence post and was screaming at the water with the moral outrage of a creature that has never in its life been inconvenienced and does not intend to accept it gracefully now. August dressed in 40 seconds. Downstairs, Mrs. Fitch was already moving through the house with the calm efficiency of a woman who had done this before, bundling good quilts, stacking them high, filling every available container from the pump before the rising creek could reach the well. "Your cameras," she said when she saw him. "Everything else, leave it." By the time August made it out the door with both cases and his tripod, the water was at the bottom step of the boarding house porch. He stopped for one moment, one single moment of professional instinct overriding common sense, and took a photograph of the main street of Gallows Creek with the flood advancing up it in the gray pre-dawn light. He did not know, standing there with his boots already wet, that this photograph would be the first piece of evidence in something that had not yet happened. He did not know, yet, what he was a witness to. The town had 43 residents on an ordinary day. By the time the water reached the main street, 39 of them had made it to the First Methodist Church of Wyoming Territory, the one structure in Gallows Creek sitting on ground high enough to matter. 4 people did not make it in time. 2 elderly sisters named Beach, who lived in the lowest house and refused to leave, were found the following afternoon sitting in their kitchen with water up to the chair seats, playing cards with the tranquil composure of women who have simply outlasted too many things to be impressed by one more. The Gunderson boy, 12 years old, was swept 50 yards downstream and pulled out by Deputy Cal Marsh, who dislocated his shoulder doing it and afterward could not lift his right arm above his waist. The boy was fine. And Reverend Thomas Hollis, pastor of the First Methodist Church of Wyoming Territory, was not in Gallows Creek at all. He had ridden out 3 days prior to perform a wedding ceremony at a ranch 20 miles east, the road back now a river of its own invention. The 39 people who made it to the church arrived wet and frightened and carrying whatever they had managed to grab in the dark. They found the doors unlocked. They found the pews dry. They found candles adequate in number. They did not find a working stove. The chimney pipe had rusted through over winter, and no one had gotten around to fixing it yet. They did not find enough food. They did not find their preacher. What they found instead, sitting in the second pew from the back on the left side, was a man named Cole Decker. Cole Decker was somewhere in his middle 30s. He had stopped tracking the precise number around the time he robbed his first bank. The two events connected in his mind as a general reorientation of priorities. He was lean in the way that men who move constantly are lean. Not starved-looking, but economical, as if his body had decided long ago not to carry anything it didn't absolutely need. He had dark eyes and a jaw that had been broken at least once and set by someone in a hurry, giving his face an asymmetry that was not unattractive but was immediately noticeable, the way a scar on a good piece of wood is noticeable. Not a flaw exactly, but the record of something that happened. His wrists were connected by a short length of chain to a ring bolt that Deputy Cal Marsh had driven into the oak pew the previous afternoon, before the flood, when Decker had been the only prisoner in the Gallows Creek jail, and Marsh had needed somewhere dry to put him fast. The ring bolt was set in seasoned oak. It was not going anywhere. Neither, consequently, was Cole Decker. "Morning," he said, as the wet and frightened residents of Gallows Creek filed into their own church and found him occupying it. No one answered. They sorted themselves into the pews by some unspoken social geometry that August found immediately fascinating. Families with children toward the front, older couples in the middle, single men and the three women from the Silver Spur Saloon settling toward the back, with the practiced discretion of people accustomed to taking whatever space remains after everyone else has chosen. August settled into the last pew on the right, not joining any group, which was his habit, and he was beginning to understand his particular usefulness. Marsh sat beside his prisoner and cradled his bad arm against his chest and closed his eyes. He had the look of a man swallowing something large and sharp and trying very hard not to let it show. "He's got a gun somewhere," Marsh said, to no one in particular. "Searched him twice, couldn't find it, but he's got one somewhere in here." He said it without opening his eyes. He said it the way a man states a fact he cannot act on and cannot stop thinking about. August looked at Decker. Decker was watching the room with the dark, patient attention of a man who has spent his adult life reading spaces quickly and accurately, because in his line of work, the alternative was getting shot. His eyes moved from face to face with the methodical calm of someone taking inventory. Then they stopped. August followed his gaze to the far corner of the church, the dark corner behind the last pew on the left, where the morning light did not quite reach. There was nothing there, just shadow and the irregular line of the floorboards in the gloom. Decker looked away. His face did not change. August opened his first camera case. He set up his tripod at the back of the church and took the second photograph of that morning. The interior of the First Methodist Church of Wyoming Territory, the high south windows admitting gray morning light, 39 wet and displaced people arranged in the pews like a congregation assembled for a sermon that would not come. In the center of the frame, visible between the heads of the families at the front, the white painted lectern stood on its raised platform, empty, waiting. He did not notice, until he developed the plate 3 weeks later in a dark room in Cheyenne, what was visible in the lower left corner of the frame. In the dark corner behind the last pew on the left, where the morning light did not quite reach, 3 of the floorboards were not flush with the others. A gap ran along their edges, faint but unmistakable. The kind of gap that means something has been moved and replaced in a hurry, by someone who assumed no one would be looking that carefully. By someone who arrived before the flood. By someone who had time to prepare. The practical matters were addressed by noon with the efficiency of people who understood that panic was a luxury with an extremely high cost. Margaret Holt organized the food. She was 61, nearly deaf, and had spent 4 decades managing rooms full of people who underestimated her, which had given her a comprehensive understanding of both human nature and inventory management. She moved through the church with 2 of the older children, opening tins, counting jars, measuring the wood pile stacked against what she found: 8 tins of peaches, 2 sacks of cornmeal, 1 small wheel of hard cheese, 11 jars of preserved vegetables, a sack of coffee, and no working means to heat anything. The hand pump in the vestry drew from the well, so water was not the immediate problem. The fireplace in the small anteroom off the main hall, a room barely large enough for a desk and 3 standing people, which Reverend Hollis had used as his study, could burn wood from the pile, though the chimney drew poorly and filled the space with smoke if the fire ran too hot. Dr. Ephraim Greer, 63, claimed the anteroom for medical purposes. He claimed also what remained of his whiskey for the same purpose, which everyone accepted because his hands were steady, even when the rest of him wasn't. And in the first hour, he proved this by setting Marsh's dislocated shoulder, a procedure that produced a sound like a green branch snapping, and a silence from Marsh that was its own kind of heroism. Margaret came to August when the inventory was complete, and sat beside him and gave him the numbers with the clipped precision of a woman who respects facts too much to soften them. 11 days, she said. Perhaps 12 if we are careful, shared equally. And if we're not careful, then less. She looked at him steadily. Keep your camera ready, Mr. Reeve. Sometimes the most important thing a witness can do is simply be one. August was not sure yet whether she meant a journalistic witness or a legal one. He would come to understand she had meant both. He was putting the lens cap back on when he noticed one of Cromwell's men, the youngest of the 4, perhaps 22, broad through the shoulders with hands the size of coal shovels, and the specific confidence of someone whose size has always been sufficient argument in any room he has entered. The young man was standing near the anteroom door, not doing anything, just standing, watching the food shelves through the half-open door with the calm, assessing attention of someone who is not looking at what is there, but at what could be taken, and when, and how. When he felt August watching him, he turned and walked away without expression. August kept his camera up. The people August documented in those first hours were these: 14 children under 12, 7 married couples. Margaret Holt, who had brought 3 books and a bag of knitting and appeared to regard the flood as a mild scheduling disruption. Ephraim Greer, whose hands were reliable regardless of what the rest of him was doing. Judge Wallace Kane, the territorial magistrate for the Eastern District, who had arrived the previous day to preside over Cole Decker's trial, and who had to be guided to his pew by 2 men because he was drunk enough that the floor presented genuine navigational challenges. 3 women from the Silver Spur Saloon: Dora, perhaps 40, with hair that had been auburn once and would be again given access to civilization. Nell, 32, dark and quiet in the manner of a woman who has learned that quiet is a useful thing to be. And Bertie, 19, from Cincinnati, who had come west 6 months ago carrying a coin her mother had pressed into her hand at the train station, a Liberty Head nickel with a small cross scratched into the back, the only thing of any value she owned, and who still sometimes looked around with the expression of someone waiting for an explanation that was clearly not coming. And Silas Cromwell. Cromwell was 56, built like a draft horse gone gray, with the voice and bearing of a man who had spent so long being listened to that he had lost the ability to conceive of a room in which he wasn't. He owned the largest ranch in the county. He employed 40 men during season. He sat in the 3rd pew with 4 of those men arranged around him, and from the moment he settled into that pew, he had the look of a man conducting his own private inventory of the situation, not of the food or the water or the structural integrity of the church, but of the people, of who was strong and who was weak, and what that meant, and how it might be used. August photographed him early, on instinct. He would later be glad he did. The gun was found on the morning of the third day. Bertie found it. She had been on her hands and knees between the pews in the gray morning light, searching for her mother's coin, the Liberty Head nickel that had come loose from her coat pocket somewhere in the first chaotic hours. Her hand closed around something cold and smooth that was unmistakably not a coin and unmistakably not a floorboard. She held it up. Small, silver-handled. The morning light caught it clean. "Is this anyone's?" she said, in the tone of someone who has found a dropped glove. The room went still. Everyone who had been paying attention, and by the third day everyone was paying attention to everything, understood immediately whose it was. Marsh had searched Decker twice and found nothing. The gun had been somewhere in the church from the beginning, waiting with the patience of an inanimate object that has nowhere else to be. Deputy Marsh was on his feet, his bad arm pinned to his chest, reaching with his good hand. "Give me that!" Bertie looked at Marsh. She looked at Decker. She looked at the gun. She was 19 years old, and she had come west from Cincinnati 6 months ago, and there is a particular kind of perception available only to people who have had to figure things out fast or suffer the consequences of not figuring them out. She had developed that perception early. She had been exercising it constantly since she arrived in Wyoming. It had not let her down yet. She walked past Marsh to the second pew from the back and set the gun on the wood beside Cole Decker. The room erupted, not loudly because there were children at the front, but in the urgent, compressed whisper of people who have discovered something they don't know what to do with.
Get this stuff out of here
"What
right
in
now!"
the..." Marsh started. "It's his gun," Bertie said. "He should have it.
Where did you put
He
the
is a
money?
prisoner. He's chained to a pew with a ring bolt in oak," Bertie said. "He's not going anywhere." She looked at Decker, then back at Marsh, then at the room. "But someone in this room has been taking food in the night. And there's one man chained to a bench who can't do a thing about anything." She paused. She was choosing words with the seriousness of someone who understands that what she is about to say will not be taken back. "I thought he might want it. In case." The room waited. Cole Decker looked at the gun beside him. He looked at Bertie. Something moved across his face that was quieter than gratitude and more durable than surprise. The expression of a man who has not been looked at directly in a long time and is not entirely sure what to do with it. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time in 3 days that anyone in the church had spoken to him as if he were a person rather than a condition to be managed. Marsh looked at August. August looked at Marsh. Neither said anything because there was nothing practically speaking to be done. The bolt was in the oak. The chain was on the bolt. And the gun's presence changed nothing about Decker's capacity to go anywhere. And they both understood, without saying it, that Bertie had been correct in an assessment that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with what was actually happening in that room. Cromwell, in the third pew, watched this entire exchange with his 4 men arranged around him. He said nothing, but the youngest of his men leaned toward him and said something too quiet to hear. Cromwell did not respond. He did not correct him either. August took the photograph. Judge Wallace Kane, by the morning of the third day, was a different man. The whiskey was gone and would stay gone, and what emerged when it departed was not the wreckage August had expected, but something harder and more precise. The mind of a man who had been blurred at the edges and was now sharp all the way through, in the way of a blade cleaned of rust that is now simply what it always was underneath. He called August over on the third afternoon and looked at his camera cases with the assessing eye of a man taking inventory of available resources. "You've been photographing everything," he said. "That's my commission." "Your commission is from a magazine," Kane said. "My concern is more immediate. If something happens here, if there is violence, if property is taken in quantities that affect survival, your photographs may be the only record. I have no court reporter, no clerk, no documentation of any kind. He looked at August steadily. If we need to establish facts afterward, you may be the only evidence we have. August had thought of himself as a journalistic witness. He had not thought of himself as a legal one, which was a different and considerably more demanding thing. What do you want me to do? Keep photographing, Kane said. Everything. Don't decide what matters. Let me decide that. Later. And if you've already photographed something you don't understand yet, keep it. Don't discard anything. August thought of the photograph he had taken at dawn on the first day. The church interior. The corner behind the last pew on the left. The 3 floorboards that hadn't sat flush with the others. He had set that plate aside without examining it closely. He had been too focused in those first hours on documenting faces, on capturing the shock and displacement of 39 wet people finding shelter, to look carefully at the edges of the frame. He had not gone back to it. "All right," he said. On the night of the 3rd day, Silas Cromwell stood up and addressed the room. He waited until the dinner portion, cold cornmeal, measured by Margaret with the precision of a pharmacist, had been distributed and eaten. He waited until the candles were lit and the temperature had dropped enough that every breath was visible. He waited until Marsh's arm was obviously paining him and the deputy's face had gone the color of old wax. He waited until the room had settled into the compressed, exhausted quiet of people at the end of their 3rd difficult day. Then he stood, and he spoke well. He had the practiced fluency of a man whose words had been shaping decisions for decades, and the confidence of someone who has never had to wonder whether the room is listening. He spoke about practicality, about responsibility, about the reality that some people in the room were going to be needed more than others when the water receded, for clearing debris, checking structures, doing the physical work of restoration, and those people needed to remain capable. He was not suggesting anything unfair. He was suggesting something necessary. His men would need a larger portion of the food starting tomorrow. "The food will be distributed equally," Margaret said. She had not looked up from her knitting when he began. She looked up now. "Miss Holt." His voice was patient, the gentleness of a large thing that does not need to demonstrate its size. "I respect your role here, but this is not a classroom." "No," she said. "In a classroom, I had the authority to remove disruptive students." A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter exactly, but its echo. Cromwell looked at Marsh, whose arm was in a sling fashioned from a choir robe. He looked at Judge Kane, who looked back at him with steady, sober eyes that gave nothing at all away. He looked, briefly, at Cole Decker. "In the absence of proper authority," Cromwell said, "practical authority falls to those with the capacity to exercise it. That is not a principle I invented. It is simply how things work." "That's a good speech," Cole Decker said. His voice was conversational, not loud, not theatrical. Just a man making an observation from the second pew from the back, as if he had been waiting for a natural pause in the proceedings, and had found one. Everyone looked at him. He was sitting where he always sat. His chained wrists rested on his knees. The silver-handled pistol was on the pew to his right, exactly where Bertie had placed it 3 days ago. He had not touched it. He was not touching it now. But everyone in the room was aware of it, in the way that everyone in a room becomes aware of a window during a storm. Not because anything is happening yet, because of what could. "I've heard that speech before," Decker said. 5 or 6 versions. In a bunkhouse in Nebraska, the senior hand said the older riders needed bigger portions to keep their experience available to the outfit. In a mining camp in Colorado, the foreman said the men doing the hardest labor needed double ration to maintain production. In a cattle operation in New Mexico, the owner said the men who owned the cattle couldn't be expected to eat the same as the men who herded them. The speech always ends the same way. The man giving it ends up with more. The people listening end up with less. The reason he gives doesn't really matter, because by the time anyone figures that out, the arrangement is already established, and everyone has gotten used to it. "You're a bank robber," the youngest of Cromwell's men said, leaning forward in his pew. "You don't get a vote." "I don't want to vote," Decker said. "I'm just telling you what kind of speech you're listening to. What you do with that is your own business." He looked at the young man. The young man looked back with the hard confidence of someone whose size has always been sufficient argument. But August noticed, from the last pew, with the attention of a man who had spent 3 days watching this room, that the young man was not looking at Decker's face. He was looking at the gun. The gun had not moved. Decker's hand had not moved toward it. It was simply there, on the pew, where Bertie had placed it, and the young man was looking at it with an expression that was doing rapid, private calculations about distance and chain length, and what a man could reach and what he couldn't. Whatever answer he arrived at, he sat back. "Sit down, Silas," Judge Kane said. The court voice, flat, terminal, the voice of a man who is not inviting further argument. Cromwell stared at him for a long moment. Then he sat. His face was the face of a man doing arithmetic, not about tonight, but about the days still ahead, about what was still possible. He looked at Decker one more time. Decker was already looking somewhere else, as if the matter had been settled some time ago and there was nothing further worth attending to. Margaret's food inventory on the second day had been accurate. On the fourth morning, it was not. She came to August before the others woke and sat beside him and told him quietly. 2 tins of peaches missing. A portion of the cornmeal. Numbers that could not be explained by the agreed-upon rations. "Who?" August asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "I've been teaching for 40 years. You don't address an infraction until you understand its shape. Otherwise, you give the person time to construct a story." She looked at him. "But you have photographs from the first morning." August looked at her. "The corner behind the last pew on the left," she said. "I noticed the floorboards the first day. I thought it was just settling. Old building, wet ground." She paused. "But then I thought about the fact that Mr. Cromwell arrived at this church before anyone else. He was already sitting in his pew when the first families came through the door. In a flood. At 4 a.m. She let that sit for a moment. "I thought about what a man might do if he knew the flood was coming. If he had, let us say, some advance indication." August felt something shift in his understanding of the previous 4 days. A slow, cold rearrangement. The way ice cracks from the center outward. "He prepared," August said. "I think he may have," Margaret said. August stood. He went to his camera cases first. He found the plate from the first morning, the one he had set aside in those chaotic early hours, too focused on faces and shock and displacement to examine its edges carefully. He held it to the south window light now and looked at it the way Kane had asked him to look at everything, without deciding in advance what mattered. The church interior, the displaced people in the pews, the empty lectern in the center of the frame. And in the lower left corner, in the dark behind the last pew on the left, 3 floorboards sitting a 1/4 inch higher than the boards on either side. A gap along their edges, faint but unmistakable. The kind of gap that means something has been moved and set back down by someone who assumed no one was looking carefully enough. Someone who arrived before the flood. Someone who had time. August set the plate down. He looked at Cromwell, asleep in the third pew, his large gray head tipped back and his 4 men around him. He looked at the dark corner. He picked up his camera. It was Nell who confirmed it, on the morning of the 6th day. She came to August before dawn and sat beside him and spoke quietly. During her watch at the anteroom door, at 2 in the morning, she had seen Cromwell go to the far corner behind the last pew on the left. She had watched him move 3 floorboards. She had watched him reach into the space beneath and take out a cloth sack and take from it and carry what he took back to his seat, where he ate by himself in the dark while the rest of the church slept on rationed portions. "Did he see you?" August asked. "No," Nell said. "I'm good at being still." "How much is down there?" "Enough," she said, "that if it had been shared from the beginning, the children would have been eating better than they have." August went and found Judge Kane. What followed was quiet. The most consequential moments in August's experience were always quiet. Kane moved the floorboards. He counted what was in the space beneath. He looked at Cromwell, who was awake by then, watching from the 3rd pew, and the look that passed between them had the quality of 2 men who have known each other long enough to be done with pretense. "I purchased those provisions," Cromwell said, 2 days before the flood at Henderson's store. "I have receipts at the ranch." Kane looked at him. "2 days before the flood," he said. "That's right. The flood that no one predicted." A silence. "The creek was running high," Cromwell said. "I've lived in this county for 20 years. I know what a high creek in May can do. And you chose to prepare privately," Kane said, "rather than warn your neighbors." Another silence. Longer. "I was protecting what I paid for," Cromwell said. "You were letting children go short," Margaret said. She was standing in the doorway, and she was looking at Cromwell with the expression of a woman who is not surprised, who knew something was wrong from the beginning, and who wishes with a particular and quiet ferocity that she had been wrong. The room was fully awake. The children in the front pews were held close by their parents. Cromwell's 4 men sat in the 3rd pew. The youngest of them was on his feet. He was looking at Decker. Decker was looking back at him, not with menace, not with threat, with the absolute, patient stillness of a man who is not afraid, who has not been afraid for a single hour of the previous 6 days, and who does not need to announce this because the announcement is continuous and does not require words. The gun was on the pew. It had not moved in 6 days. Decker's hand was not near it, but the young man's eyes kept going to it, to the distance between Decker's hand and the grip, to the length of the chain, to the arc of what was possible and what was not. He was doing the mathematics of the situation, and the math was not working in his favor. He sat down. Cromwell looked at his men. He looked at Kane. He looked at Margaret, still in the doorway. He looked at the 30-some people of Gallows Creek watching him from their pews. And then he looked at Cole Decker, who was no longer looking at him, who had already looked, as if the matter had concluded some time ago and there was nothing further that required his attention. "I built this county," Cromwell said. He said it quietly. He said it the way a man says a thing when he is trying to determine whether he still believes it. "The food will be distributed equally," Margaret said, "starting now." She began dividing it. The rain stopped on the night of the 7th day. It stopped completely and without warning, as Wyoming weather makes its decisions, as if a choice had been reached at some administrative level far above the visible world and simply implemented without announcement. The silence it left behind was startling. People woke up because of the quiet. August woke at 2 in the morning and could not return to sleep. He sat in the last pew and looked at the church in the candlelight, the sleeping shapes, the hanging blankets, the breath visible in the cold air. He looked at the empty lectern at the far end. He looked at the dark corner behind the last pew on the left, where the 3 floorboards had been replaced and sat flush now, giving nothing away. Cole Decker was awake. He was sitting where he always sat, his chained wrists resting on his knees, his eyes open in the dim light. The gun was beside him on the pew. He was looking at nothing in particular with the patient, present attention of a man who has spent enough time in enclosed spaces to have made a kind of peace with them. August got up. He walked to the second pew from the back and sat down at the far end. Decker watched him come and waited. "Can't sleep," August said. "Me neither." Outside, the creek was audible now that the rain was gone, lower and more even than before, descending toward its own banks with the patient regularity of something that had done what it came to do and was now returning. They were quiet for a while. 11 years, Decker said, as if continuing a conversation that had been paused. "Since the robbing," August said. "Since I decided I was done pretending one thing was another." He looked at his chained hands. "I was a cowhand before that, 6 years, $30 a month. Bunkhouses with 12 other men. I looked around at the men who'd been doing it for 20, 30 years, and I looked at what they had and I thought..." He stopped. "I thought there had to be another way to be in the world. And bank robbery was the answer. It seemed more honest. With a bank robbery, everybody in the room knows what's happening. Nobody's giving a speech about practical authority and community interest. Nobody's hiding food under the floor while children go short and calling it protecting an investment. You knew," August said, "from the beginning. You saw the floorboards the first morning." Decker was quiet for a moment. "I saw them." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Not my place to say it," he said. "Needed to be found, not announced. Announced, it's just one man's word against another's. Found," he looked at the corner. "Found, it's a fact. And facts are harder to argue with." He glanced at August. "You were the one who should have found it sooner. You had the camera." August felt this land. "I was documenting," he said. "There's a difference." He seemed to come to this the way he came to everything, not as a prepared thought, but as something arrived at in the moment, honestly. Between documenting and witnessing. Documenting, you're recording what's there. Witnessing, you're responsible for what you see. You were doing the first one for a while before you started doing the second one. The candle between them guttered and steadied. "What happens to you?" August said. "After." "Hang, probably," Decker said. The same tone he might use to say probably rain tomorrow. "Kane's a hanging judge. I knew it when they brought me here. I was hoping for Cheyenne, different judge. I got Kane." "That's all right." "Are you afraid?" Decker considered the question seriously, which August was coming to understand was how he considered everything. "You take pictures," he said.
Something is real.
"Because I want a record," August said. "Because if something is real, it should be documented, so there's proof it happened." "That's why I'm not afraid," Decker said. "I've been real. All of it. Every day of it. Every choice of it. I didn't spend my life saying I was one thing while being another. I knew what I was. I did what I did, knowing what it was." He looked at August. "You were in that room for 6 days with a man who hid food from hungry children and called it protecting an investment. And a judge who was drunk as a lord for the first 2 days of a flood. And a cattle baron who'll go back to being written up in the newspapers as a pillar of this county. I'm the only one going to hang. But I'm not the only one in this room who did something they knew was wrong." August looked at him for a long time. "Why didn't you use it?" he said. "There were moments. When Cromwell's man stood up. When the room was close to something. You could have..." "I know," Decker said. "Then why?" Decker was quiet. Outside, the creek continued its patient descent. "Because Bertie gave it to me," he said finally. "Because she was 19 years old and she looked at that room and she decided I was the kind of man who deserved to have his own gun back. And I wasn't going to prove her wrong." He looked at the gun beside him on the pew. She saw something in me I was trying to be. The least I could do was be it. August picked up his camera from the pew beside him. He looked through the viewfinder at Decker's face in the candlelight. The broken jaw, the dark eyes open and unafraid, the chained wrists resting easy on his knees, as if the chain were simply a thing that was there, not a thing that defined him. "Can I?" August said. Decker looked at the camera. He understood, August thought, what was being asked. Not just permission for a photograph, but whether he wanted to leave something behind. Whether he wanted to be seen and kept by at least one person who had actually been paying attention. He straightened slightly, not posing, not performing, simply settling into the fullest version of himself. "Go ahead," he said. The shutter opened and closed. In the small silence after, Decker said, "Make sure it's a good one." "It is," August said. He was not in the habit of telling people what he thought of his own work. He was not in the habit of lying either. On the 8th morning, the water had dropped 6 inches from the high mark on the church door. On the 9th morning, 14. On the 10th morning, Deputy Cal Marsh walked out through the church doors and stood in 4 inches of brown water and looked at what the flood had left behind. The wrecked corrals, the furniture-strewn street, the Gunderson boy's hat caught on a fence post 50 yards from his house, and declared it passable. The 39 people of Gallows Creek packed their things and walked down the hill. Cromwell walked with his 4 men in a cluster slightly apart from the rest. He did not speak. His face was the face of a man doing serious arithmetic, not about what he had lost in the church, but about what he had revealed, and what the revelation would cost him in the days and months ahead. In a town where everyone who mattered had been present to see it, he would not be charged with anything. The hidden food could not be proven to have materially harmed anyone in a court of law. The inventory was disputed, the legal ground uncertain. He had simply been seen. He would have to live in this town, having been seen. It was not a cost that appeared on any receipt. It was not a cost that could be managed with practical authority or settled with resources. It was the cost of being known, accurately, completely, without the language of practicality and community interest to obscure it. Bertie walked between Dora and Nell, her eyes forward, until the group reached the jail. She stopped outside and watched Marsh unlock the door and Decker walk through it. At the cell, Marsh locked the door. He stood at the bars for a moment. He was a practical man, not accustomed to saying things that didn't need to be said, and what was visible on his face was the effort of a man deciding that something needed to be said, regardless.
I've had a lot of time to think in here.
"For what it's worth," Marsh said. "What you did in there. What you didn't do." He stopped, because he had used most of the words he had for this kind of thing. It counted. People saw it. Decker looked at him from the cot. "It's worth something that you said so," he said. "Thank you, Cal." Marsh nodded once. He closed the outer door. He stood on the other side of it for a moment in the small, quiet jail. Then he went to his desk and sat down and did the paperwork that was required of a man in his position. Outside, Bertie stood for a moment, looking at the jail door. Then she turned and looked at the town around her, the water line on every building, the mud in every street, the work of restoration that would take months. Then she looked up at the sky, which was clear and blue and entirely indifferent to the previous 10 days, as Wyoming sky tends to be. She went to work. The trial of Cole Decker was held the following Friday in the Gallows Creek courthouse. August arrived early and set up his camera in the back corner of the room, where the morning light came through the east windows at an angle that served his purposes. He had been thinking since the 7th day in the church about the difference between documenting something and witnessing it. He had decided, without being able to articulate it precisely, that the difference had something to do with whether you were prepared to be changed by what you saw. Judge Wallace Kane presided. Sober, precise, absolute in his application of the law, the way a surgeon is absolute with a scalpel. Not cruel, but without the luxury of sentiment. The evidence was clear. 3 witnesses. The bank records from the First National of Laramie. A teller who identified Decker across the courtroom without hesitation, in the direct and certain manner of someone who has spent a considerable amount of time remembering a face. The verdict took 40 minutes. Cole Decker was sentenced to hang at the Territorial Prison in Cheyenne on the 3rd Monday of July, 1883. The room was very quiet when Kane read it. The kind of quiet that follows something irreversible, not shocked silence because everyone present had understood from the beginning how this would end, but the silence of people confirming something they knew was coming, and finding that knowing it in advance did not make hearing it much easier. August looked through his viewfinder. Decker was sitting very straight in the defendant's chair. His hands, unchained now for the proceedings, were folded on the table in front of him. His face was exactly the face August had photographed by candlelight in the church. Present, clear, unafraid. The broken jaw, the dark eyes. And then Decker turned his head and looked directly at August's camera. Not at August, at the lens. As if he knew exactly where it was and had been waiting for a particular moment to look at it. The way a man waits for the right moment to say a thing he has been meaning to say, and then says it clearly, without flinching, and is done. August pressed the shutter. He did not know whether the photograph would be technically adequate. The light was difficult, the distance significant. What he knew was that the moment was real, that he had been present for it, that at least one person in that room had been paying attention in the way that mattered. He lowered the camera. Decker looked away. The bailiff moved forward. The room began its business of concluding. August stood in the back corner for a long time after everyone else had left, in the empty courthouse with the morning light coming through the east windows, thinking about what he was going to do with what he had. August Reeve published 12 photographs in Harper's Weekly in November of 1883, under the headline, "Life on the Wyoming Frontier." The editor in New York wrote him a congratulatory letter describing them as charming and authentic. The letter mentioned the flooded Main Street, the children on the church steps, the old couple before their rearranged house, Margaret Holt photographed from the side, reading by the church's south window, the high water still visible through the glass behind her. The letter mentioned the empty lectern, which Harper's ran without caption. Several readers wrote in asking what it meant. The editor replied that it was a study in negative space, which August read and thought was exactly right, in the way that things can be exactly right and miss entirely. The letter did not mention the photograph of Cole Decker in the candlelight, or the photograph of Decker in the courthouse looking into the lens, because August had submitted neither of them. He kept both. He kept them until he died in New York City in 1921 at 65, by which time he had produced some of the most widely reproduced images of the American frontier and had never once spoken publicly about the flood in Gallows Creek. Among his private papers was a single index card, undated, in his handwriting. Some photographs are not made to be seen. They are made so the photographer knows that what happened, happened, that the person was real, that someone was paying attention. This is sufficient. This is, in fact, everything. Silas Cromwell sold the largest portion of his holdings in 1887. He moved to Denver. He was written about in the Denver papers as a pioneer and a builder of the West, which was accurate in the ways that things are accurate when enough is omitted. Deputy Cal Marsh became sheriff of Gallows Creek County in 1885 and served 11 years. His shoulder healed imperfectly, and he could never raise his right arm above his shoulder, which made him a noticeably worse shot, but did not appear to materially affect his ability to do the work. He was elected 3 times and never ran unopposed. Margaret Holt retired from teaching in 1891. Someone had counted that she had taught approximately 340 children in 40 years. She died in 1897 at 75 in her own house, in her own bed, with her books on the shelf and her knitting in the chair beside her. Judge Wallace Kane continued on the bench until Wyoming statehood reorganized the courts He did not drink again as far as anyone knew. He died in Laramie in 1902, his obituaries praising his absolute impartiality, which those who had been in the church with him thought was probably more complicated than the obituaries understood, and probably, in its way, more honest. Dora left Gallows Creek in the spring of 1884. She went to San Francisco. She opened a boarding house on a good street and ran it with the precision of a woman who had spent her life studying human nature and had finally found a productive use for what she'd learned. Bertie. Catherine Annabeth Wells of Cincinnati married a telegraph operator in Cheyenne in 1886. She had 3 children. She did not often talk about Gallows Creek, but she kept, in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, a small silver-handled pistol. Her oldest daughter found it when Bertie was 50 and asked. Bertie sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the gun for a moment. "I found it under a church pew once," she said, "during a flood. I gave it back to the man it belonged to." "Why?" her daughter asked, "if he was a prisoner?" "Because he was the only person in that room," Bertie said, "who didn't pretend to be something he wasn't, not for a single minute of 10 days. While a man with a ranch and 40 employees hid food under the floor and made speeches about community, while a judge got drunk enough that 2 men had to guide him to his seat." She looked at the gun. "He sat chained to a pew, and he said what was true, and he didn't use the gun when using it would only have proved he was afraid. I thought that deserved something, even if it was only having your own gun back. Was he a good man?" Bertie considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, seriously, without rushing to an answer that would be easy. "He was an honest one," she said. "I've lived long enough to know that's rarer." She closed the cedar chest. She put her hand on the lid for a moment. Then she stood up. There were things to do. There were always things to do. Cole Decker was hanged at the Territorial Prison in Cheyenne on the 3rd Monday of July, 1883. The warden's report noted that he was calm, that he declined a last meal, that he declined the prison chaplain, that he made no final statement. The report described the execution as efficient and without incident. The report did not mention the man who stood in the shadow of a support pillar at the far end of the yard with a small portable camera, who documented the proceedings from beginning to end, who packed his equipment and left without speaking to anyone, whose hotel records for that week listed him in Laramie, which is not the same as Cheyenne, and is not the same thing as being in Laramie. The photograph he may or may not have taken was never published, never exhibited, never cataloged, never found. Only the index card remained, in his handwriting, in the papers he left behind. Some photographs are not made to be seen. They are made so the photographer knows. The flood of 1883 deposited 4 feet of silt across the lower quarter of Gallows Creek, Wyoming Territory. The town was rebuilt the following year on higher ground. The First Methodist Church required no structural repair, being already at elevation. It served its congregation until 1941. The building was demolished in 1952. Several of the pews were salvaged by local families. The second pew from the back on the left side, the one with the ring bolt set in seasoned oak, was taken by a family who used it as a garden bench. The ring bolt remained. The people who sat on it over the following decades sat in the sun and did not think about it. It held them up, as it always had, as it was always made to do.